When I want to get away from the hustle and bustle of New York City, I go to Greenwood Cemetery. I make the pilgrimage about once a season, no matter the weather.
Alrighty, here I am in Brooklyn. And yeah, it's loud. I see Greenwood. I just have to cross this busy street and then I am there.
Past the towering Gothic gates, you enter a whole other world. An oasis kerplunked in the middle of this metropolis. For me, there's so much to love about this place. First of all, it's quiet. I can even hear the pine needles under my feet. Secondly, in Greenwood, you're up close and personal with nature.
Ugh. So many knots in this tree. I'm just gonna touch them. Wow.
Vanessa, not to interrupt your story here, but you were so into this tree.
Dude, that's not even the beginning of how nerdy I was out there.
Oh my god. I think that's a hawk. I just saw a hawk. Wow. Okay. Nerdy birding over.
Vanessa, you know you see nature in a lot of places, right?
I know, but Greenwood's special, I swear.
What's amazing to me about Greenwood is all the Gothic architecture.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, completely. I mean, walking around, seeing all these angels on pedestals, these obelisks going into the sky. I mean, I even saw a mausolea with serious, like, Notre Dame vibes.
Plus, the fact that Greenwood has lots dedicated to African Americans is pretty extraordinary.
Wait. Tell me more, because I haven't come across those lots any of the times that I've been to Greenwood.
Well, you might have missed them. See, the grander graves and mausolea, those are the private lots. But there are also public lots. And that's where the cemetery's African Americans are buried.
Okay, so how do I tell the difference between private lots and public lots?
You know, I could tell you, dude, but honestly, there is someone at Greenwood who I think should show you instead.
What you do here?
I'm Neela Wickremesinghe, and I'm the Director of Restoration and Preservation here at the Greenwood Cemetery.
Neela described the difference between the private lots and the area where we were standing, which was more sparse and with smaller gravestones.
So it's just like any other rule of real estate, right? You want to be up on a nice hill, you want to be where you can have your family next to you. But if you want to be in Greenwood and you want to take the most affordable route, you could be buried in a public lot.
Back in the 1850s, a private lot would have cost you around $100 or about $3,000 in today's money. But a public lot, which allowed for several burials at different depths, went for only $5, so about $160 in today's money.
Greenwood recently inventoried the graves and found that about a third of the people buried there are in public lots. But unlike the private lots, which tend to be more preserved and thoroughly documented, the public ones are more run down, with fewer clues about who rests there.
You know, big mausoleums, big obelisks, those are easy to recognize, right? It takes a little bit more time and effort to look down and read a headstone that's small, but that doesn't mean that there isn't information to be gleaned from.
Neela tries to tackle public lots whenever she gets a chance. And in 2017, she asked a colleague of hers to recommend a section of the public lots badly in need of preservation.
Neela's colleague told her that there was a part of the cemetery known as the colored lots.
But, you know, I'm sure there's some work that needs to be done there. And I was like, great.
She went to check out the site, but was discouraged by what she saw. For the past 170 years, the gravestones in these 7 lots had sunk into the ground, broken, or disappeared completely.
In some ways, Neela was too late. But with luck, she thought, she might still glean some new information, still save some headstones, and still uncover some stories.
Welcome to Urban Roots, a podcast from Urbanist Media that dives deep into little-known stories from urban history.
We're your hosts. I'm Vanessa Quirk, a cities journalist.
And I'm Daryl Hussein Wetzel, a historic preservationist. In today's episode, we're going to go past the well-known, well-kept grounds of Greenwood's private lots and take you to its public ones.
We'll talk about the ways in which Greenwood has begun to preserve the memories of the people of color buried there.
Before we can get there, however, you should know more about the history of Greenwood and how it came to be.
The most often asked questions when I do tours of the cemetery is, did you have to be rich to be buried at Greenwood Cemetery? that was not the case. The cemetery had public lots.
That's Greenwood's historian Jeff Richman. He literally wrote the book on this place.
Greenwood's story starts in the early 1800s, when the country was new and New York City was barely a city at all.
But it was growing fast. If you were 15 years old in New York City in 1820, by the time you turned 35, you would have seen the city's population triple from 123,000 to 312,000.
At the same time that that's happening in New York City, they are having problems with yellow fever.
In those days, the living buried the dead in churchyards, close to where they lived and worked. But scientists around this time soon realized that leaving diseased corpses in the middle of cities was not the best idea from a public health perspective.
And so you're getting this huge jump in the number of people living in the city, and you get the concomitant need for dealing with more and more bodies of the deceased. And so how do you do that?
In Europe, cities tried a new approach. They set up cemeteries in the rural areas beyond city limits.
The first so-called rural cemetery was Père Lachaise, built on the then outskirts of Paris in 1804. The next one was in England.
And then that idea comes to America in 1831, Mount Auburn Cemetery, Cambridge, Massachusetts, servicing the city of Boston.
The idea wasn't just to keep the living safe from the dead. It was also to keep the dead safe from the living.
A speech at Mount Auburn's dedication in 1831 shows the thinking at that time. Here's Jeff reading an excerpt.
Why should we expose our burying grounds to the unfeeling gaze of the idler, to the noisy press of business, to the discordant shouts of merriment, or the baleful visitations of the dissolute? And so the impetus there is very much the idea of separating out and honoring the dead and not allowing them to be part of the hubbub, the commercialization, the noise, the urban problems, and get them out into a different space.
A few years after Boston got its first rural cemetery, Henry Evelyn Pierpont, a businessman from a wealthy family in Brooklyn, decided he would create New York City's first rural cemetery based on the Mount Auburn model.
In 1838, he purchased 175 acres just south of what today are the Prospect Park and Park Slope neighborhoods. At the time, of course, they weren't really neighborhoods at all, just woods and grazing land.
And because Pierpont wanted Greenwood to serve everyone in Brooklyn, he, from the beginning, set aside some land in the cemetery for the public lots.
He also wanted this to be a destination that would draw people not just from Brooklyn, but across New York City and the world. So he commissioned the creme de la creme of architecture and planning.
For example, he hired Richard Upjohn, the architect famous for designing Trinity Church in downtown Manhattan, who created Greenwood's main gatehouse in a signature Gothic Revival style.
He also hired David Bates Douglas to design the cemetery's landscape with artfully meandering pathways and lush vegetation. Remember, at the time, there was no Central Park, no Prospect Park. So when it opened, Greenwood was one of the very few public places Manhattanites could go to escape the city and be in nature.
At first, few people wandered the grounds. But over time, politicians, celebrities, and socialites chose Greenwood as their final resting place. Once the public started visiting, they loved it.
Greenwood becomes this great attraction where people can get out of the urban center and commune with nature, enjoy grass and trees, and in turn have a religious experience. As you're communing with nature, you are communing with God at the same time. By the 1850s, Greenwood is attracting 500,000 people a year.
After Niagara Falls, it was the nation's second most frequented tourist destination.
Over time, New York's newer parks and attractions eclipsed Greenwood in popularity. But it remains an important place in the city's history.
In 2006, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. The nomination touts how Greenwood's architecture and landscape design makes it a shining example of the rural cemetery movement.
But its long history of providing public, affordable lots isn't mentioned at all.
Nor are the colored lots.
If we only remember Greenwood as a resting place for the famous, the powerful, and the rich, we risk forgetting the histories of many of the people buried there, including its African Americans.
Which takes us back to Neela. When Greenwood offered Neela the support of 8 high school interns, all students of color, she gave them a mission to find out everything they could about the so-called colored lots.
Here's one of those students.
So hello people, I'm Darryl Jones. I'm from Brooklyn, New York.
In 2017, Daryl was a high school sophomore. 5 years later, he's a young preservation professional about to start working at Greenwood full-time. I met him at the cemetery so he could tell me more about the first summer he spent there.
Are any memories coming back to you right now?
I remember some of the pop music that came on the radio. I still remember the train horn. I love the train horn it's right there. Yeah, I love that sound. You know, it brings me back.
Daryl's connections to Greenwood actually go back quite a bit further than 2017.
My father's job is actually right across the street.
Daryl pointed to the bus depot next door, where his father works as a cleaner.
And so I knew from going there when I was little, this is Greenwood Cemetery. So across the street, such a contrast. But I like the industry, all the mechanics and stuff like that inside the depot. And here I get to experience all the nature, even more than that, all the history.
When Daryl arrived for his summer internship, he was eager to dive into all that history. He and his fellow interns started in Greenwood's archives.
While the records didn't specify race, they did have some information. People's names, country of birth, what they did for a living, where they died, and what they died from.
It began our introduction to all the diseases they suffered from back then that affected their daily lives, like dysentery, tuberculosis, namely. Not just that, how they lived back then. And many people were very, very busy. Some were veterans, some were housekeepers, some people were handymen.
Neela and the students also followed survey maps from the 1910s that showed what markers and headstones should be where.
But when Daryl and his fellow interns arrived on site, they found that the real-life situation wasn't as neat and tidy as the maps had made them believe.
It looked like a stereotypical Halloween scene. Most of the place was in shambles. There was bird waste on headstones, many of them were chipped and broken.
So they got to work. First, cleaning and repairing the headstones they could see.
I do remember this narrow one. Looks like a very narrow tree stump. Yeah. We filled in with mortar all the cracks and crevices here so as to look more presentable.
What did it look like when you found it before?
So before, it looked like it was literally about to fall apart, so we tried the best we could to prevent that. We cleaned it a little bit very carefully. We sprayed all the headstones here with a thing called D2 spray, which cleans off lichen and moss and stuff like that and bird waste, and we wash it down with a hose and we carefully brush it away as well.
Then came the trickier task, digging and probing for the markers and gravestones that they couldn't see. Here's Restoration Chief Neela Wickremesinghe again.
Digging things up out of the earth, that's the fun part. But sometimes, we did come across headstones that we knew where they were supposed to be. We would probe, we'd felt something, and then we just found pieces, and that, having to explain that, I hate, as a conservator, having to say, I can't fix something, right? Because that's my main job, is to fix things that are broken.
Daryl still remembers the day when they searched for the grave of Rufus Cliff, who died of consumption at the age of 17.
Jabab said, hey, somebody's monument is here. And we found it. That's the only good part, we found it, but it was all nothing but pieces. It is a feeling of almost like overwhelming dread. Yeah. So what we had to do, we dug it back into the ground, but very respectfully and very carefully. We tried to piece it back together the best we could. I believe we got it vaguely to the shape that it was, but definitely not what it was originally. But it was very shattered. There's a shocking experience to see that.
Neela told us that all the students weathered moments like this.
I had a student who was crying. It's tough, because we were really excited to try to, who knows what we were going to uncover, right? Every time we would uncover something that we could read, or we went back to the lot book, found that person's name, and checked the census and see, where did they live? Where did they live in Brooklyn? Did they live in Brooklyn? Did they live in Manhattan? How'd they get here?
Yeah. Is there a story that you remember of like one gravestone or marker or monument in particular that you kind of looked up and...
So I remember this one. This is one that we found.
Mm-hmm. So this was underground before?
Yeah, tiny headstone,
yeah,
right?
It's small. I'm getting down on the ground to see it.
It's maybe 13 inches high, right?
Right.
But I have the names of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, right? So this is a mother, a father, and 3 children.
Wow.
So even though this is such a small thing, it had a lot of information. We had 5 names that we could put through the census.
Would you mind reading the names?
Let's see. We have John B. Wilson and Mary Jane Gardner, parents of Zeebe, Zeebe.
That's a cute name.
Theed and Jimmy K.
And
right?
There like there's a date there too, right?
There is, and I think one is 1861, 1862, 1863, right?
Whoa,
so
they
that
died in quick succession.
tells you that these were all infants, right?
Wow.
So we also talked about infant mortality and why women were dying in childbirth. These are the kind of discussions that are important to have because I don't actually have to say much. This historic document, the monument, tells that story without me really having to say much because it can be really apparent. Also, a wonderful thing about this is that this was something like 3 feet in the ground, and it came out looking pretty good. You know, I can still read all the names, which is not the case on most marble headstones. So sometimes things are safer in the ground, and then you can sort of discover them later.
As Neela and the interns found names, they would return to the archives for more clues. Over and over, they read about a specific organization that owned many of the public lots in the area, the Colored Orphans Asylum.
The Association for the Benefit of Colored Orphans served to house, educate, and care for African American youths who had lost their parents or whose parents could not care for them.
3 white philanthropists founded it in 1836.
We're lucky to know much about the asylum at all. Why? Let's go back to 1863. The country's enduring the Civil War. The Union is desperate for soldiers. And President Lincoln decides to instate a draft lottery.
One could buy their way out of the lottery by paying $300, but that was the equivalent of a whole year's salary for a working white man at the time.
Working-class white men rebelled. For 4 days, they caused mayhem in the streets. People home from war pulled out artillery cannons that they had just used against Confederate soldiers.
But these mobs didn't take their fury out on the wealthy. They targeted another population that was exempt from the draft, African Americans, who Lincoln didn't draft only because the country didn't consider them citizens at all.
One of the mobs, about 500 white men, women, and children, they go after the Colored Orphans Asylum.
They beat down the front door with an axe and set the building on fire.
While the mob was at the front gates, the caretakers were able to sneak all 233 children out the back.
They were lucky. The riots resulted in the deaths of at least 119 people. Historians now suspect it's more likely that thousands of people died.
Few records remain about the Colored Orphans Asylum, except at Greenwood. So I asked Neela if she could take me to an orphan's grave. She walked me to a prominent stone marker, a few feet from Phoebe, Zeebe, and Jimmy K.
So, here it says, in memory of Mary Stockdale.
This is a way bigger stone.
Way bigger?
Yeah.
Way bigger.
Mary Stockdale was a white woman who worked at the asylum. Dozens of black people had been buried here over the years, but the only clearly marked grave that remains is Mary's. Neela says the students struggled to process that.
Again, that's another thing where I'm here, and they're like, what do you mean there's no monuments for any of these children? And the only one that's there is for a white woman, which is hard. Without those archival pieces, it's hard to really flesh out this story, and thankfully we have those supporting documents to fill in the rest, right? Because here There's no such thing as an unmarked grave because there's a stack of paperwork in our archives that really allow us to know what was going on, even though we might not have a monument in front of us.
Neela and the interns did the research that they could to uncover the stories of the other African Americans buried in these lots.
People like Rufus Cliff, the young man whose gravestone had shattered into tiny pieces.
Like Lucinda Williams, a devoted member of the Bridge Street African Methodist Episcopal Church, a congregation with a history of fighting for Black rights since the days of the Underground Railroad.
And John Monroe, a carpenter. When Daryl and I met at Greenwood, he walked me to that grave and told me about John's life.
He served in the 35th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops during the American Civil War. He was also a member of the Bridge Street African Methodist Episcopal Church for 47 years.
Neela told me that the more she and the interns learned about the people buried in these lots, the more they wanted to commemorate them.
The group created an interactive website that combines archival maps and photographs to tell a fuller story of who lies in the colored lots.
They also asked the staff at Greenwood if they could rename the colored lots. Here's Daryl again.
It didn't sound good. It was sort of racist. And we all decided on the freedom lots because these people are not just free from many of the agony that they face, but also they're just free spirits and free in the universe, that they are not held down anymore.
So at the end of our project, I said, okay, we're done. And then they were like, yo, we got to do flowers. And I was like, of course, I'm sorry. So we spent a day at the florist, and every single headstone got a planting to make it feel a little bit more visited. We did bulbs so that every year it would show a little something.
With the headstones cleaned, the flowers planted, and the website finished, Neela suggested one last touch. Daryl Jones walks me to a large rectangular poster board showing a map of the graves, some text describing the restoration, and some photographs of the interns at work.
I'm looking at my picture right now. It's surreal that I'm here. Yeah.
Wait, where are you on the picture?
That's me right there.
Oh, you look different.
Yeah, that's me. So, Neela decided to make this board, and it was all a team effort to memorialize that we have this sign right here, so everybody knows the history of what happened here and what we did in 2017 to make their lives more noticed and know that these people, they were people that walked the earth. They were loved, they were acknowledged. So their lives, even though you may not see all their stones or they're in great disrepair, isn't less significant than the lives or the stones or monuments of anybody else in the cemetery. So their lives are just as important as anybody else.
Tending the flame of their memory, that's what the work is about.
The stories are here, we just have to start looking for them. That's the exciting part, is that we're just starting to really look deeper into other aspects of our history that might include people who we have not really known much about in the past.
Thank you for listening to Urban Roots, brought to you by Urbanist Media. Your hosts are me, Dela Hussein-Wetzel, and Vanessa Quirk.
This episode was edited by me, Vanessa Quirk, with help from Connor Lynch on sound design. Cheryl Duvall offered story editing support. And Andrew Calloway not only mixed this episode, but helped me pull off a socially distanced recording. Thanks, Andrew.
Many thanks to Jeff Richman, Neela Wickremesinghe, and Daryl Jones from Greenwood for making this episode possible. And a big shout out to the interns who worked with Neela to preserve the stories that we shared today. To learn more about their work and the history of the Freedom Lots, you can find a link to their interactive online content in our episode notes.
Our music is by Adam James Levinarity. You can check out Adam's band, Lost Amsterdam, at amsterdamlost.com.
This episode would not have been possible without the support of our listeners and those who have donated to our fundraising campaign.
If you liked this episode, then you should subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please take the time to give us a really good rating because that helps us to keep our show going.
And thanks to you for listening to Urban Roots and helping us unearth these little-known yet significant stories of urban history.
Till next time.